Good evening.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. How about yourself?
I'm doing well, and considering all the events going on around us, but I'm doing well.
Absolutely. I think we all can say that, we got some measure of health and some measure of sanity. Seems like some around us that don't have those two things.
Yeah, so we got to be thankful for that.
Amen. Amen. So may I ask you please to tell us your name?
I am Dr. Henry McKoy Jr. Uh, I'm in Durham. I'm a professor at North Carolina University School of Business.
And is there anything you'd like to share about yourself personally that helps us to get to know you a little bit better?
Well, I got to the academic space in a roundabout way. I started my career actually as a banker. I was a banker for a number of years and really saw the challenges that, particularly minority, Black and brown entrepreneurs had with getting access to capital, and wanted to make a difference. And so I did all I could, trying to push myself, internally up the ranks, and then felt like I wanted to do more. I left and set up my own investment banking firm, and created a way to be more directly impactful to get capital to entrepreneurs. From that, I somehow realized or got pulled into this political realm as it relates to the impact of the public sector to kind of creating a successful economic ecosystem. And so ended up in the political arena. I served as Assistant Secretary of Commerce here in North Carolina a few governors back under Beverly Perdue. And so, this route to the academic space really has been a roundabout one, but I think it gives me a very unique perspective when I think about theory versus practice and how the two go together.
Excellent. So I'm sure you are well versed in redlining. And I have had a number of conversations with people, not necessarily of my race or gender, about redlining. And people find it hard to believe that the federal government sanctioned redlining, creating districts in places where Black people could live, creating ghettos, creating housing authorities, all of these things in an effort to ensure, and I think ensure is the right word, we did not prosper. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, it's a fact. I mean, I think that's one of the more unfortunate and disturbing facts is that, I mean, we obviously know the history of America in terms of its relationship between the different races. And, we often think about that, through the lens of things like slavery and, the transatlantic slave trade and that part of history. We also recognize that, Reconstruction after the Civil War lasted a very short amount of time, and then Jim Crow took over in the South. And so we recognize that. And we somehow think that, once we got to the civil rights era, that, everything started moving in a certain trajectory. But you look back at the history of the United States and looking through policy, particularly, I mean, policy going back to, everything from, again, the New Deal to the benefits that soldiers got, the GI Bill, things like that. All those things were racialized, and so to your point, housing ended up being one of those things. In the color of law, they kind of go into it in a real significant manner. But to kind of put it in a summarized standpoint, for one, the public sector or the public housing that we now know to be public housing wasn't created for Black folks. It was really created for white folks who were, moving to these very fast growing areas, and they needed places to live. And so white folks, were the ones that the public housing actually were built for. And then as the kind of the marketplace grew and the suburbs were created, then the white folks fled the inner cities and they moved Black folks in and created all these policies around, that separated families and created penalty for all those kind of things. In terms of your particular question about redlining, the earliest, federal housing agency laws basically said that, the FHA, which is still the major backer of first-time homeowners and folks like that, to essentially tell a bank, look, this person, we want to encourage home ownership, this particular individual or family we want to support in getting housing, so the government will back that loan. If they default, the government will pay for it. Well, the first caveats or covenants of the FHA basically said that the only way the FHA will back loans would be essentially if Black folks aren't in those neighborhoods, or if only white folks are in those neighborhoods. So imagine that the federal government has time to sit down and say, hey, we will create this policy that will support home ownership across the United States. However, we're going to put this, it won't even in fine print. It was just flat out in the print that said that the only way we will ensure a neighborhood is if there are no Black folks in that neighborhood.
Right.
And of course, that then translated to banks and folks who were already, discriminating in terms of lending, and just gave them kind of a federal mandate to do so.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to that for a minute, but I want to go back and ask you something about specifically for housing. So one of the things that we saw, well, at least when I was old enough to see, was white flight, right? So if a Black family moved into a white neighborhood, and then this was actually sanctioned by law as well, but they had real estate agents were allowed to put these ridiculous terms together that would prevent a Black person from moving into the neighborhood. But when they finally got tired of kicking us that way, we then were able to move in, but then it became white flight. So white people would move out of the neighborhood would decrease in value, and thus Black people's economic growth was then stifled. But when you talked a little bit about, slavery and Reconstruction and all that stuff, what happened to the 40 acres and a mule? So we saw them march the Indians off of their native lands and put them in these little quadrants and said, here you go. Why hasn't Black people gotten their 40 acres and a mule? What stopped that, and why did it stop?
So that's a very interesting question, and it's particularly interesting because people hear 40 acres of a mule, right? And the mule is, some folks say, oh, well, that's a myth, and other folks say this and that. But the fact is that actually was, it was kind of laid out going to be a policy. But what we have to think about is, if you think about the war and the fact that essentially at the end of the Civil War, the North prevailed, slavery was officially ended. But not long after the Civil War, of course, Abraham Lincoln was killed. He was assassinated, going to the theater, and Andrew Johnson took over as president. Andrew Johnson, who was from North Carolina, born and raised in Raleigh, a white supremacist, and essentially, so many of the things that Abraham Lincoln had talked about putting in place, that Ulysses Grant had essentially pushed for. When Andrew Johnson became president, he pushed back all those things. So Reconstruction ended up being a very short amount of time, and so the 40 acres and a mule that was supposed to be put in place for Black folks didn't happen. And if you look at that over the course of time, not only did that 40 acres and a mule not happen, but then, you had things like, these homestead acts that basically opened up land to white folks, essentially. The reason why they call the Oklahoma Sooners is because essentially Oklahoma was opened up and said, okay, whoever gets here kind of first gets the land. But of course, that didn't count for Black folks. And so that policy was put in place that basically said, okay, you can come and you can kind of whatever land you put your hands on, if you're white, you can essentially take over that land. But then you got to still keep going down the kind of path, because Black folks still, some Black folks still had land. But if you look at things like, in recent times, the way that so many Black farmers have lost their land because they couldn't get loans like white farmers, they couldn't get access to markets like white farmers. And so, you just going all back to, coming out of slavery up until modern times, there's just been consistent policy and action put in place that has been driven by the federal government in partnership with private folks that have either kept land from the Black community, or they have essentially taken land from the Black community.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the points that you didn't say exactly, but I think it's just dangling right there, is gentrification, right? So if you take someplace like Hilton Head Island or Charleston, any of these places where we were left with the remnants of whatever land we could get. So I remember reading in one of my history books somewhere about the amount of land that Black people lost in Hilton Head by these little snake oil salesmen who came in and say, I'm going to give you $20,000 or $25,000 or whatever it is. And when you hear that, you think that's a lot of money if you've not had access to money, not had access. And then what you have is now Hilton Head, which is this beautiful resort town, Charleston, South Carolina. And I mean, you can go on, where Black people are losing what they live, where they live in their land and their true asset, the 1-2 credential that doesn't seem to be subjective to the ups and downs of the market. So now we are in 2021 or 2020, and you look at this and you see predominantly Black neighborhoods where it's high crime, low income, white people coming in and building a $400,000 or $500,000 house right next door to the crack house or whatever is in that neighborhood. And then after a while, the families that are around them can't afford to live there anymore, so they're forced out. And it's curious to me, how come we as a community haven't recognized the value of real estate, and why, if you get into a place where you're in a pickle, ask someone for help. Ask someone, don't just sell your property because somebody says some outlandish number to you. So my husband and I, we have a second house, and I would say almost every day we get a call. Somebody says, we'll pay you $150,000 sight unseen. And then it said, but it's got to meet certain criteria. I'm like, I block their number. They can't never call my number again. But some of us are not educated enough to know how to do that, because we've been in an economic tornado for most of our existence. The whim of the winds. Whatever the white folks want, whatever we haven't had a voice to be able to be strong enough to fight against gentrification or to hold on to our property.
I mean, I think it's a lot of that. I mean, so gentrification certainly is a ongoing challenge, and it's always been there. I mean, it's just because essentially, what ended up happening, if you think about you mentioned white flight earlier, you think about, kind of what happened where you essentially, some of the earlier, like I said, the first public housing was done by white folks, and then there was a certain level of integration. Then the white folks fled and left the Black folks, in the communities behind. Historically, I mean, during segregation, all the Black folks were left behind together. And so, the teacher, the banker, the preacher, everybody was in the community together, and there was a certain amount of economic benefit that came with that the money kind of circulated around. Well, once the civil rights movement kind of moved into place and we started having social integration, a lot of the Black folks who could move away did move away, right? And so that's what you left behind, the folks who were least mobile, who had the least resources. And so that Black dollar that was at a higher level moved and integrated into the white community. And that's the thing about social integration and economic integration. It essentially went one way. I mean, where the Black dollar went into the white community, those left behind, you create these ghettos, you create these low-income communities that sat there and festered for decades. I mean, literally nobody's putting investment in them. Red lines still happen, even though it might have become outlawed. It still happened. Other means, right? They find new ways to keep from investing in community. They just call it something else. So those communities, they decline. We see these cycles of movement, and so then people decide, okay, well, we'll start moving back into the city or these urban areas because that's kind of cool. But the thing about it is that when you start seeing gentrification, folks start moving in, and tax values get elevated. As you said, I mean, I have an additional house as well. Get those same phone calls and those same. I don't even know how people get my
exactly.
They say, oh, they call by my name. We buy this from all this kind of stuff. But the problem is that I remember. The late great Andrea Harris, we were having a conversation. She was talking about what we kind of call the Black tax, right? And the Black tax is this, right? If you go into a Black neighborhood, and I think it comes down to as simple as this: if you want to know how to raise the value of a property, you move Black folks out, move white folks in, right? You ain't got to change anything else except who's in the house, and that's the crazy part. I mean, home ownership or the valuation of home ownership is supposed to be something that is essentially, it's supposed to be objective, right? It's supposed to say, okay, well, this marketplace is this house is this size, it has these kind of amenities, et cetera, et cetera. It should be valued at this. It shouldn't have anything to do with who's in that house. But we all know, I mean, as Black folks, I mean, it may not be as say pronounced now as it has been historically. But real estate agents will tell you, if you're trying to sell a house and you're a Black person, take down those culturally, kind of focused pictures and stuff and make it look neutral. They
Right.
never ask white folks to do anything like that. And so,
Never.
gentrification happens as folks move in. And the thing about it is, I always call this, I kind of, my background is city and regional planning, or at least part of my background is city and regional planning and banking and investment. But we have in the Black community a lot of time what I call level zero investment, which means that if you're a Black community, you just aren't getting any investment. The public sector is not putting money into you. The private sector is not putting money into you. They're going to let you sit there and fester in your own decay, and the house is going to run down. And then they're going to come in. They're going to basically they're going to tell you that you got some kind of ordinance that you break in. So they're going to fine you. They're going to fine you because this and that. I need resources. What I call level one kind of investment means it's total gentrification, right? So there's often been nothing between. It's like, okay, well, either we're gonna let you sit in your own kind of poverty, or we need to move you out someplace. We don't care really where you go. We just need to move you out. And again, immediately and miraculously, all the property value goes up. And so that in modern times is an incredible kind of way that we lose wealth. And what we didn't talk about in between that was the things like, the urban renewal, where you got highways that ran right through neighborhoods and destroyed houses and businesses and all those kind of things with no real compensation at all. And so, that's why, I mean, when I talk to leadership, particularly local leaders and particularly public sector leaders, they always want to say, well, Henry, what are the one or two things that we need to be doing to really change this? And I say, well, look, Mayor, I can tell you one or two things, but we didn't get here with one or two things. We're down by 1,000 cuts, and these aren't just paper cuts. I mean, these are major kind of lacerations, and so we're not going to get to some other place without doing something just as dramatic going in the other direction.
Absolutely. I got some more things to come back. We might have to have a second, third chat about this. I had so many questions to ask, but I want to go back to your banking experience in creating your investment bank. So you mentioned highways going through neighborhoods and stuff like that. So we can think about Durham, right? So the Durham Freeway, it disrupted Black Wall Street in Durham. You had Tulsa, but it's burned it down out of pure spite and jealousy. You have these communities where Black people manage to dig themselves out of the dirt. They stand up their own lives. They're not dependent upon anyone but themselves. They're self-sufficient. And yet, somewhere or another, we manage to tear these communities apart without compensation, without acknowledgement. If you remember when Bill Clinton was president, he did some I wouldn't even say apology, but he put some kind of words out there that said something about enslaved people in this time, but it wasn't really, I don't think he meant it, or maybe if he meant it, it didn't sound sincere to me. Anyway, there's that. And then, so here in Durham, mechanics and farmers. So I have 3 degrees from North Carolina Central and have 1 from East Carolina. So when I finally graduated and got myself together, I started sending money to North Carolina Central as an alum, so send my money to students to help them get in, because I remember that fight. Right. And put money in the Black bank. Both of those things are challenging to do with. So we want to support communities of color. We want to support businesses that are helpful for Black and brown communities, but the opportunity to do so sometimes becomes so difficult that how do you do that? And how do we engage our younger people to help them see the value of that? And then I'll ask you one more piece of question onto that. So other groups that come into our neighborhoods and sell to us, and I'm sure you can think what I'm talking about, hair salons, so I don't think I ever found one in Durham that's owned by a Black person or a brown person, they're owned by, other folks. You have 1 or 2 Black or brown restaurants, that do really well and are self-sustaining. But for the most part, these companies come and put up a what do you call that? A little store, 7-Eleven kind of store in the Black community and all that stuff. How does this attack on our finances become so neutral to us that we are not even challenged by it? We don't even blink an eye about it anymore. You go to the store to get some whatever you get for your hair, or you go to get something from the 7-Eleven, and you don't ever think about why isn't that thing owned by a Black or brown person? Because the borrowing ability for Black people is different and brown people, or is there more to the story?
I think you started out in the right place talking about access to capital. I mean, at the end of the day, and I think to kind of answer your question at the end and then go back, the way it ends up happening over time is that you kind of you indoctrinate or you kind of internalize what you see, right? So, for example, I did some research a few years ago talking to folks around Haiti that grew up in Haiti in the Black Wall Street era, and they tell these great stories about they knew this business owned over here and this person owned this and that, and I've written about this, and I've done as best I could to kind of create these kind of appendices of businesses that existed, and they all diverse. I mean, diverse businesses all across the board. And I remember talking to somebody, and they said, well, I was going to grow up, I was going to start a business, I was going to do this and that, and they did that. And I said, well, how did you, why, how did you know that you could do that? And they said, well, because I saw it all around me. I mean, it was that simple. I saw it all around, and when you go long enough without seeing it, then young people feel like they can't do it. So I mean, that's why, I mean, to draw an analogy, I mean, why you have so many little Black kids saying, okay, I can be an NBA player, I can be an NFL player, because they see it all the time. Less talking about, I'm gonna be a hockey player, things like that. And so to that point, as related to this particular topic, in a capitalistic society, capital matters. I mean, flat out, I mean, capital matters, money matters. And we talked about before this idea of gentrification in communities. Well, I've also seen what happens whenever, say you have somebody in particularly this happens a lot with older folk, right? Because they're the ones who perhaps have owned their own home and they've lived in a neighborhood or whatever, and now their roof is caving in. They own fixed income that's very low. The house is falling apart, and somebody comes up and say, hey, I'll give you XYZ for that house, and I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. I give you XYZ for the house, and I don't want to do that. So a couple of things ends up happening. Either as you said, somebody they find, say, okay, I give you some amount of cash that really is not a ton of cash, because generally the reason why they're buying your house is because everything else is much more expensive, and so you can't, the replacement value of selling a house for $60,000 in cash, it doesn't get you another place to live in that same marketplace, because and so either you sell and you get compensated for something that you can't afford to move elsewhere, or you don't sell and the house just crumbles around you, right? And so at the end of the day, if you don't have access to capital, you can't create these businesses. And so to your point, what you had historically, when you had the major Black institutions in place, they were interested enough in kind of literature, the ideas that the golden era of Black entrepreneurship was during segregation, which and that's because the money in some ways was forced to go around there. But you talked about running the highway through Haiti, and talked about burning down Tulsa, Oklahoma. We know the Wilmington race riot, massacre, which actually, interesting enough, is the last time, probably the closest thing we came to yesterday, where there was a kind of be a coup d'etat, a coup. I mean, that's essentially what happened in Wilmington back in 1898. I mean, it was driven by a Black business owner, the guy that owned the newspaper. He was, and so it ties that. But then there's also this, what they call the Red Summer 1919, where like 40 or 50 communities around the country, Black communities, were destroyed. Yeah, burn them to the ground. Chicago and all these places, and what ends up happening is that when you are legally allowed to basically destroy black property and Black life without consequence, you burn down businesses. How do you replace that in a world where you can't get access to capital? And so what has happened over time is that I always talk about it through the idea of an ecosystem, because these communities are ecosystems. And sooner or later, these species of what we call Black businesses of a certain type, they become extinct, and they start to disappear and they start to die. And so to your point, a lot of it goes back to this idea of access to capital. What made Durham's Haiti unique, even from Tulsa and other places like that, is just the capital base that it had. You had, North Carolina Mutual Insurance, which itself was its own capital behemoth. Think about this. You have people walking, once a week, paying $1 a week for, a policy insurance for something they don't need. Nobody has to pay out for another, decade or 2 decades. And so the founders and the leaders of the Spaldings and the Merricks and those folks of North Carolina Mutual, they took those dollars that had that float and they invested it locally in entrepreneurship and business. So they created their ecosystem. Those same individuals created McKoy Farmers Bank. They created savings banks. They did all these kind of things. And so they understood the power of the dollar from that standpoint. I say this and then, you can kind of ask me the next question, but essentially you asked about kind of today and age. I mean, we are in an age of, kind of immediate gratification and satisfaction. And so, for example, just like, individual Black folks have hard access to get capital, so do Black businesses. And so I was in banking back in the mid 90s during the heyday, what was called the Glass-Steagall Act, which stopped interstate banking before then. So banks could only be local. Well, the Glass-Steagall Act under Bill Clinton they got rid of it, and that opened the door for these mega banks. And so that's how Bank of America was born, through from North Carolina National Bank to Nations Bank to Bank of America. I was at Central Carolina Bank, which merged with all these banks in South Carolina and Georgia and Tennessee, and became SunTrust and now Truist. All these banks started merging, and they used the market to do that. Black banks weren't able to do that. They weren't able to get access to capital to grow and expand. And so, heck, I pick up my cell phone and I hit a button and I can transfer money from here to here. Well, if I'm a Black bank and I don't have access to the kind of funding to set up that technology, I'm not going to have it. And you think that some 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old who's always had everything at their fingertip, is going to be willing to trade, make that trade between convenience and this, and it's just not happening. And so, and then that becomes kind of its own kind of cycle in itself. And finally, McKoy Farmers is an interesting example. McKoy Farmers is one of the oldest banks in the country, Black banks in the country. It's one of the few remaining Black banks in the country. McKoy Farmers it used to post every single year. They would post their kind of revenue results, right? And McKoy Farmers for something like 117 years they had a profit. I mean, literally, like for 117 years they made a profit. Now, if you were a white company that said you made a profit 117 years, people would be throwing money at you left and right, say, wow, how are you doing that, right? Amazon has never made a profit. They've never shown a profit ever in the history of Amazon. And it's the most valuable or closer to top valuable companies in the world. Certainly Jeff Bezos is the richest person in the world. And so it's that kind of double standard that you can't account for that. That's, again, that objectivity versus subjectivity. How do you account for the racism that's built into the system when everybody tells you it's supposed to be, that the market's supposed to be objective and fair?
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I will tell you. So while your world is finance, my world is technology. I'm working in technology for a long time. And my fight has been and continues to be to ensure that Black and brown people and underrepresented groups understand what's coming at them. If you think COVID has been a monster, wait. Because if those organizations had automated pre-COVID, many of them would not have gone out of business. And so for those people who are cashiers, waiters, whatever it is you do, truck drivers, whatever it is, automation is coming at you 100 miles an hour. And to go back to something you said a little while earlier, so now I want to apply for a loan from, I don't know, bank, I don't even know, PNC. I want to apply for a loan from PNC. So I can do it online. I can go in person. Any number of ways I can apply for them. They use this algorithm that determines, one, how much money I can get. So first of all, what my debt to credit ratio is. So, so how much money I owe and how much money do I have, right? Okay, good. That's one piece. But then what zip code do I live in? Do I live in the appropriate zip code? Is there a high crime prevalence in my zip code? Is the likelihood of me growing old in my neighborhood? All of those things are built into an algorithm that for Black and brown communities and some other communities as well, rural, poor, white people are going to be hit by this like a Mike Tyson or Muhammad Ali knockout. It's going to knock you completely out. And I don't think that we are preparing our communities for this to come. And, people think, oh, well, it's a long way off. Okay, how many of us guessed when the calendar rolled from 1999 to 2000, we thought the world was going to implode within itself, that we would be standing here where we are 2020 now, 2021 actually. These things are moving faster than you can imagine. And there's so many things happening in the background, and so many people are left out of the discussion. You know, every industry has a Black or brown or a female person in a role over there. The question is, do they have enough of those people that'll help make the tools and services that they are developing applicable for all, and not just for those who have the 1% or the 1% of the 1%, or the middle, and even the bottom. And that flows everywhere. Education, you can pick any topic and it's just right there.
But part of that is, certainly, who's in charge matters, right? And that's why I push so much around, ownership and entrepreneurship and things of that nature, because, folks design things based on their perspective of the world. And to your point, interesting enough, I was, when I first went to college, I went as a computer science major. I thought I wanted to be a programmer, but kind of got pulled into economics because it was fascinating to me in terms of what was going on or what wasn't going on in the Black community from an economic standpoint. But even early in my banking days, I spent time, working in technology. And so this is interesting from a historical standpoint. Technology has always, in so many ways, had an adversarial impact on the Black community, right? So if you think about going back to even the slave days, right? I mean, technology plays such a critical role in the fact of even making the slave trade work, right? Whether you're talking about building these new high finagle ships that you can lay bodies down in, compasses and things that help them navigate the waters to get from this place to another place. The first kind of super duper technology market really was focused around slave torture, right? I mean, literally, if you look into history, you got all these huge markets around, torturing mechanisms for slavery. I mean, certainly the fact that somebody has a gun is a technology. You have a technology, you can go someplace and you can overtake folks who haven't seen that technology. So there's this long history of how technology has played such a negative role in the Black community. And then as you're talking about this with kind of automation. So even during slavery, as kind of like things like the cotton gin and all that kind of stuff started happening, folks like, oh, well, that should kind of make it easier for slavery. No, it doesn't, because now this machine can process this cotton so much faster. Now they need you to pick more cotton faster. Right. So all this stuff is happening. And then you move it up to kind of, as you say, these kind of modern times, technology keep displacing Black community. So, you talk about, like William Julius Wilson, the scholar who wrote When Work Disappears. Well, part of When Work Disappears is because some machine took the place. And every time we go through these kind of disruptions like this, you have, this kind of automation that happens, that then you create these, what they call these jobless recoveries, right? So it's like, oh, well, we recover. We now actually have a big economy than we did before. But we just think we don't need as many people working in it. And guess who's the ones who we're going to leave out?
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah, and so it's often, and so that's why if you really want to transform Saudi, it's figuring out how do we support Black technologies, things like that. I mean, we know that in over the Christmas holidays, I know I saw a couple of stories about the whole facial recognition situation, right? And there were the facial recognition that had kind of picked the wrong Black dude. They said he stole something, and I mean, so technology has just been such a challenge as it has been in displacing the Black community and disrupting us economically. It'd be wonderful to have technology have the ability to operate in a different way and to be a positive force in the community.
Yeah, that's wishful thinking. Because I would say what you read in over the holiday, you can take back to 2015 when Google first released their facial recognition software. The only people who worked in the development, only people who worked in the design, white male. So every time it saw someone that was not of that hue, it put up a picture of a gorilla, and that thing turned IT world upside down. But we knew this was going on all the time. These algorithms that grant loans, these algorithms that accept people to college, these algorithms that say how much insurance you can have. All of these algorithms are biased and sometimes just straight out discriminatory.
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
and so, you take companies like these Silicon Valley companies, and you look at what their organizational structure is made of: white male, few females here, white females here and there, but all the rest of the people that are really doing the grunt work are at the bottom, almost exactly like slavery. So it is going to take us time to educate our people, to get them to understand this. And I'll give you one more in your area of expertise: fintech. So I remember the first time I went to our fintech conference, and I was sitting there in the room, and I was just shocked by all the things I was hearing, right? So we would hear about the unbanked and the underbanked. We'd hear about, these cashier stores where you give up 20% of your pay just a cashier check because you don't have a relationship with a bank, all of that stuff. So once fintech got past its annoyances to the federal regulators, they started looking at it as a real thing, right? So they're slapping financial regulations around fintech. One of the statements that's embedded in fintech is the erasure or the elimination of cash money, any kind of paper transaction. So either it's on your phone, it's in your hand, it's on your finger, but it's not in a bank. It's not underneath your mattress. And that money that you've been saving on your mattress, or you got in your bra like grandmama used to have and all that stuff, that money will become null and void. So blockchain and Bitcoin is the way to go. And both of those things, they came out, people thought they were gimmicks. Look at the price of Bitcoin today. I mean, just Bitcoin by itself, just outrageous. So for Black and brown communities who we believe in cash, right? We prefer to be paid in cash. We like to have our money in cash. We want to see it. Yes, we can log into our bank and check our account, but the history of the banks going under back in the day. So, people were kind of not so comfortable with putting their money in the bank. So, we've kind of grown from that. We diversify our money. We have money in 3 or 4 different banks. But then at the end of the day, they're taking that away from us. And so you're going to get paid by some kind of blockchain transaction. It's going to go somewhere, and you only can access it through biometrics.
Well, interesting enough, if you, there's a I can't remember the name, but recently this happened over the break as well. NFL player who re-signed his contract or something, asked that he get like half of his contract in Bitcoin or something, right? And so that was kind of interesting. Certainly a leap ahead. It'd be interesting how it plays out, because obviously it could go a couple of ways. I mean, it could end up being the greatest decision he ever made if the price of Bitcoin continue to rise. If somebody hacked the wallet, it could end up being, but he's gonna be all right either way, because he still got like $20 million in cash. But I think it's real talk here, right? And so if you think about it from a real talk standpoint, the same thing that we're dealing with right now as relates to, for example, if you notice the coronavirus and the vaccines, right? Every time I see the news story about the vaccine, the first person they give the vaccine to is somebody Black, right? And part of that is to try to get Black folks to trust it, right? So they put somebody Black in the chair, we give you the vaccine, and that makes you feel better. But obviously we know why there's a history of folks not trusting the government and vaccines. Now, whether, kind of how that relates to now or versus before, I mean, you can debate that, but there's a real history there. I mean, the Tuskegee experiment, all that, I mean, that stuff was real. It's not imagined.
Black women sterilization. I mean,
sterilization, all that stuff is real. So there's a real reason not to discuss. Let's follow that same path with banking and finance, right? If you go back to the earliest, so the Freedmen's Federal Bank, which was started, is one of those ideas that Abraham Lincoln kind of pushed forward. It was the idea that, okay, now you got these folks who used to be slaves, who now they're free men and women, they're going to be working somewhere. Where do they put their their money? They create this federal bank that ended up growing to a number of different branches across the United States. That bank ended up having millions of dollars in it from formerly slave individuals who were recently freed. It ended up being the equivalent of about $2 billion a day. When Lincoln died, Andrew Johnson appointed a white guy to run the Freedmen's Bank. Within a few years, the guy had loaned all the money, or basically put all the money away to his white friends. The bank goes belly up. Nobody ever gets prosecuted for that. Folks ever get their money. None of the Black folks who work so hard and formerly slaves never get their money back. And so, I mean, there's a reason why folks don't trust these things. And so when you start talking about the idea of not having money. I mean, a lot of Black folks grew up with people telling, always keep money somewhere. I mean, I knew, the little old lady in the neighborhood that was a loan shark, I mean, so to speak. I mean,
we all knew that person.
Yeah, she had her money in the Maxwell House can, right? You
Yeah.
know, I mean, and so I did.
And a gun sit right beside the bed if you think you're coming in rob her.
Oh yeah, she got it. Yeah, you know,
Yeah,
she gonna get you before you get her.
exactly.
And so I mean, you know, there, you know, and that's part of the challenge, right? Because people want to tell you get over it or that's in the past. I mean, this ain't like centuries and centuries ago. I mean, you
Right.
know, the system has been there to suppress, oppress, and depress us, and so you know, I mean, we can all kind of, you know, say, hey, you know, we're in the 21st century, let's move on. But these are, but the things that we look at, they're put there by pain and reality, and so you know, I think that's what, you know, part of the challenge is of transferring over. But to that other point of you know, when you go back to access to capital, if if the people who control all of the capital are white men, then white men are going to end up investing in other white men, and they're going to end up developing things they think from white man perspective. If you think about, you talked about earlier about where you buy your hair product from and who owns the companies and all that kind of stuff. Part of the challenge is that, you know, it's just like the house that somebody calling you up to say, I'm gonna pay you $150,000 cash in. Well, how many black folks you know that could call you and say, Rochelle, I'm gonna pay you $155,000 in cash, right? White folks can outbid black folks just for capital. I've seen it happen in business too. It's like, okay, you know, I don't believe there's a market here with black hair, but wait a minute, you went out and took all the risk and created it. Now, hey, I actually see there's a market, so now I will bid and I will outbid any, any black person around, and I will now capture the market. I mean, that's essentially, you know, what we're seeing here, and that's what's is really shrinking our wealth as a community in a very significant way, and that's very, very problematic in a real way.
Absolutely. And I will just say, you know, I certainly enjoyed this conversation. We could talk for hours more, and I know you are very busy, but I hope you come back and chat with me again. Um, I think your knowledge and your understanding of the cultural environment I shouldn't say are in, or I don't even know what the word right article or adjective is to say about it. Whatever this place is we are in the world, it's going to take us educating each other and not being afraid of each other and not trusting each other. And we are inherently known for not trusting each other. You know, the old thing that floats around in popular places, um, all skin folk ain't kinfolk, you know, so you get that kind of mindset, you know, that we do that to ourselves, where I don't think you've ever heard a white person say that. You know, hell, they might know Bobby's a thief, you know, so don't go over there and fool with Bobby, but they ain't gonna put out no statement like that, you know, all skin folk ain't kinfolk. We have got to get out of tearing each other down and you know, doing everything we can to destroy each other instead of recognizing, and I say this all the time, I speak specifically from being a woman, but you know, this nonsense that we do to compete with each other and to try to malign each other is only to our detriment. Hell, the reason why it's so easy to kill a black man, because as soon as y'all gone, we're gone. And I don't understand why we allow these thoughts to prevail in our society. And I'll just add one more thing about the man with the NFL player. If he got a blockchain Bitcoin bank, his money will never be lost. If he's got just got straight Bitcoin, which a lot of people do, it's not. Blockchain is the future. Debris, the diamond company, look at what they've done in Africa with blockchain. I mean, it's just from the minute that damn diamond is found in the ground to the minute it's in a jeweler's hand in New York City. I mean, it's amazing. It's an amazing thing, an immutable transaction. And that's something that most people don't even have a concept of what that means. But that's what blockchain brings to the financial market.
Oh yeah, well, yeah,
Not,
absolutely right. Yeah, and I appreciate the offer to have this conversation. I think it's an important conversation, but I think just kind of touch quickly on something you said. You know, you mentioned about, you know, kind of all, you know, skin folk ain't kin folk, and but there's also, you know, the reality around this idea of the so-called idea that the white man's ice is colder, right? I've seen situations. Now this ain't stuff I've read about. I've seen situations where I just talked about how white folks can outbid black folks. I've seen situations where a black person has sold something to a white person for lower than what they got offered by a black person. And land at that. I mean, and so it's like, because that trust factor, I always tell folks, you know, I'd get the Wall Street Journal, these things like that. You can turn on in the Wall Street Journal, you can look at A1 and these two companies are suing each other and they go into court over millions and millions of dollars, and you get the B1 and they got some joint venture together.
exactly.
So that's the difference in this idea of, like you said, I talk to black folks, I'm like, hey, you should talk that, well, that person borrowed $20 from me 20 years ago. I ain't never want to, work with them again. I don't trust them. And so, I mean, some of this it's going to have to be a change in mindset and a change in how we view ourselves. And certainly, I mean, I don't think it's far off to say that whether however you think about the Willie Lynch stories and all that kind of stuff, the reality is that, I mean, there is a lot of dissension that was sold into the Black community that today still exists, and until we are able to kind of connect and bond beyond those things, we're gonna have a hard time, as a collective moving forward. And I always tell folks like that, I'm not impressed. I mean, a Black billionaire, okay, 2 Black billionaires. I mean, I'm not impressed by. I mean, we know at this point we can create, or that folks will create singular success stories. What hasn't happened is the whole collective, and that to me is, I mean, that's the important thing.
Yep. I say the same thing all the time. If we can't do it together, it's no point in doing it apart, because hell, they can eliminate you in a few minutes. Look at O.J. Simpson, Tiger Woods. You pick any of them you want to, and they just decimate them. And, they let some of them come back, but for the most part, they destroy them. Because,
Oh, yeah.
1 or 2 of y'all are okay, but we can't have a whole group of y'all in here, but
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to leave that alone. So I hope, Dr. McKoy, you're going to come back and chat with me again. I pray that this can happen. I know how busy your schedule gets as the year moves on, but, find some time, because there's so much more to discuss. There's so much more to get your perspective on. So I hope you will come back and chat with me again. Once the video converts, I'll send you a link to it. Watch it. Make sure we haven't done anything to harm our careers. And then let me know if I may upload it. I put a couple of things in the chat. Did you see them?
Yeah, I was kind of running my mouth while you was talking, but I did, and I don't know Brando Winston.
Brandon Winston. I'm going to introduce you to him. He is from Durham as well. He wrote about John Harvey Wheeler. I'm sure you know who that is now.
Yeah.
I'm going to connect the two of you so you guys can chat, because I'm sure you both have. He's in Tennessee, but I'm sure you guys have like-minded, because my chat with him, sometimes I just sit back and shake my head. Lord have mercy. I didn't realize how little I knew about finances in America. But anyway, I did learn that Bank of America before it was Bank of America, was the Bank of the Sicilians or something like that,
Oh yeah, well, so Bank of America in the San Francisco side. So the way it happened, North Carolina National Bank, which Hugh McCall ran, grew up to become Nations Bank, which was around '96. They were the sponsors of the Olympic Games in '96. Mm-hmm. Bank of America in San Francisco was Italian, Sicilian, whatever, and so I mean there's a lot to be learned when you look at kind of how other cultural groups have kind of created institutions. Now I think obviously the key part of this is that nobody's had the same experience as Black Americans, right? So you can't draw the same connection to say, well, such and such did it, so you should do it. But they certainly are fascinating stories. I mean, the truth is that at the end of the day, white folks from all over the world have been able to come to America and essentially assimilate via changing your last name, and you marry enough times, you just become white. That's not something that has that's available to Black folks. And and if you like you said, we could talk forever, but in terms of policy, we talked about how the federal housing folks essentially redlined and all this kind of stuff, and how the federal government taking land and all this thing. But for a very long time, the policies of this country around immigration was that immigration policy had to be driven by bringing people into the country and allowing people in the country that wouldn't change the dominant phenotype of the country.
Right.
And that's why it's important to get behind the truth. There's all this kind of these conversations about, for example, slavery ended because enough white folks were upset about slavery. All this. No, it was an economic situation, right? And part of that, the reason the transatlantic slave trade originally stopped, so the reason British folks first stopped it was because they were mad because America had broken free and was doing so well, and slavery was the key to that. So the British monarchy said, well, look, you're gonna outlaw slave trade, right? But it still happened. The reason it ended up going into stopping in the United States, or at least the way it stopped in the United States, was driven by the fact that it was a story about in South Carolina how the population of Black slaves in South Carolina had outnumbered the number of white folks in South Carolina. And all these white men started getting terrified because they realized that the minute the Black slaves realized, wait a minute, The only thing keeping us where we are is our perception that you all are more powerful. It scared them to death. And so they, you had all these sleepless nights. And so that's what stopped the slave trade in America originally, even though it still kind of happened secretly, but because it was white folks starting to say, wait a minute, if we keep at this pace, the black folks gonna outnumber us, and that ain't gonna be good for us. And so, I think, it's always important to recognize the truth behind the story.
Absolutely. I grew up in South Carolina, about 27 miles from Charleston, and we were very, very poor. And my mother would go out to Charleston, go down to the water to get food, because you didn't have and they still had the socks up there. They still had every single piece of the remnants of slavery. And this is in the 60s and 70s. They had not taken it down. Charleston hadn't become the beautiful, magnificent city it is today. It looked just like it was at that time. And I think that, a lot of the mentality of how we see each other goes back to the massa is we sick. Massa is we sick.
Right.
And until we stop processing information that way and start looking for entrepreneurial ways, start looking for ways to come together as a community and a collective, we are going to be where we are forever and ever. Because someone once said to me, a white person can fall down 85 million times. He can get up and resume right back where he is. That's how we got the president we have right now. How many times he's been bankrupt? How many times he's failed?
Yeah.
He's the president of the free world.
Oh yeah, no, but we're trust to me, and I tell people this all the time. Speaking of banking and stuff, bankruptcy laws were not created because black folks were having problems, right? I mean, so trust and believe. I mean, but trust and believe it wasn't created because black folks needed a way out. And that's the thing about it is that, like you said, the laws, the goalposts move, the laws change, all that to accommodate. That, and that's the thing about it. That's what I think gets lost a lot of times in this discussion about what needs to happen going forward. We got to realize what fight we're actually up against, right? I mean, this is not a fight against simply folks riding around in sheets and burning crosses, right? This ain't a fight against having a racist uncle or grandpa or something like that. I mean, this ain't even a fight or simply like the little Rittenhouse boy that walked through Kenosha and shot the folks. This is a fight against white supremacy, and white supremacy is a much bigger foe than just fighting white racists, because white supremacy can flow through everybody. It can flow white folks that are the most liberal minded in their mind, can deliver some of the most white supremacist kind of actions and bias action. Black folks can demonstrate white supremacy action. That whole idea of the white man's ice is colder and I don't trust you. And so we got to understand the fight that we're really up against, or else we're going to end up continuing with, as they say, solutions that don't solve.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. McKoy. Now start looking on your calendar now for some new time. You got my calendar things. You can schedule whenever you want to, but start looking on your calendar.
But do me a favor, shoot me an email. So it's in my email. I got to get through. I probably get I don't know, hundreds of emails a day. So if you shoot me an email, it's in my email and I can go through and we can figure it out.
Absolutely, I will. But look at the thing. So I'm going to introduce you to Brandon. Nice fella, young fella, still struggling to find his way, but nice young fella. And he spends a lot of time in the financial market. He came to Duke Law and did a talk on finances. He did a talk on mechanics and farmers. Not really, really smart, sharp young fella. And I think you and him could do great work together. And then go look at my company.
Okay, I clicked on both links, so I got them. So as soon as I get off here, I go check them out.
All right, I'm gonna send you the calendar thing again, and I'm gonna send you a link to the video. If I don't send it to you tonight, you'll have it first thing in the morning. Thank you again. I appreciate it very much. Thank you. I know how busy you are. Stay safe. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.